The train rumbled through the underground tunnels, its steel wheels grinding against the rails with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic clatter. The air inside the packed subway car was thick, a mix of body heat, stale perfume, and the metallic tang of city grime. James Carter sat quietly near the window, his Army Ranger jacket draped over his broad shoulders, the fabric worn from years of service and memories that ran deep. The weight of his past clung to him, invisible yet undeniable. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had found him. The first words across from him stood Richard Daly, a middle-aged white man with slicked-back hair and a cheap gray suit that barely fit his frame. His face was flushed, his breath uneven, his hands curled into tight fists, and he was staring. James had felt the man's gaze for several minutes now. He had tried to ignore it, staring out the window, pretending to be lost in thought. But Richard wasn't subtle. The first words were barely more than a mutter. "People like you don't belong here." James heard them clearly, though at first he chose not to react. But then Richard leaned forward, his voice sharper, louder. "I said, people like you don't belong here." The murmurs in the train car grew quieter. The surrounding passengers, previously lost in their phones and conversations, were now glancing up. Eyes darted between the two men, watching, waiting. James turned his head, finally meeting Richard's gaze. His voice when he spoke was calm but firm. "You want to say that again?" Richard scoffed. "You heard me." James sighed, leaning back in his seat. "And what exactly do you think people like me are?" Richard smirked, his confidence fueled by the attention. He wanted an audience. He wanted control. "You think just because you wore that uniform, it makes you better than the rest of us?" His voice rose, carrying over the steady hum of the subway. "What, you expect a thank you? A free pass?" James didn't flinch, but inside something burned. The silence before the storm. The tension in the car thickened. A young woman clutching a tote bag shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A teenager with earbuds pulled one out, listening intently. A man in a business suit lowered his phone, silently recording. James had dealt with men like Richard before, not on battlefields but in bars, in back alleys, in offices where he had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously. And now on a train, in front of strangers, he was being tested again. James inhaled deeply, his fingers pressing against his knees. "I didn't serve for a thank you." His voice was measured, controlled. "I served so that people like you could have the freedom to run your mouth." Richard's smirk faltered for a split second, but then he straightened, puffing out his chest. "Oh, so now you think you're some kind of hero?" James shook his head. "No." A pause. "But I know a coward when I see one." The breaking point. The words hit Richard like a slap. His nostrils flared, his fists clenching tighter. And then he stepped forward. James didn't move, but the shift in the train car was instantaneous. Passengers tensed. A man near the exit muttered, "Yo, is this about to go down?" A woman near the door pulled out her phone. Someone else whispered, "Should we call someone?" Richard loomed over James now, his breath hot, his eyes wild with something dangerous. "What did you just say to me?" James didn't blink. "I said, I know a coward when I see one." The subway lurched, the motion causing Richard to stumble slightly. He caught himself, gripping the overhead rail. But it was enough. Enough to break the illusion of dominance he had been trying to build. A few passengers snickered. James could see it. The embarrassment, the anger, the humiliation settling into Richard's face. And then, Richard swung. A split-second decision. Everything happened fast. James had been trained for moments like this. His reflexes were sharp, honed from years of combat, from split-second decisions that meant life or death. He didn't need to think. He moved. Richard's fist cut through the air, aiming for James's face. But James wasn't there anymore. With a swift, practiced motion, he shifted sideways. The punch missed, Richard's momentum carrying him forward, off balance. James caught his wrist, just for a moment, before twisting. Not enough to break anything, but enough to send a clear message. Richard yelled in pain, his knees buckling. He nearly collapsed into the seat next to James, His face contorted in shock. The train erupted. "Yo!" Someone gasped. "Damn!" A teenager cackled. "He didn't even have to stand up." James let go, and Richard stumbled backward, his breathing ragged. His face turned red, not just from pain but from humiliation. He looked around as if expecting someone to back him up, but no one did. Instead, all he saw were phones recording, eyes watching, people waiting to see what he'd do next. And then the voice came again. "That's enough." The businesswoman had stood up again, her voice firm. "You should leave now." Richard turned to her, his jaw clenched. "You don't tell me what to do." James exhaled, rubbing his temples. "No, but I do." Richard spun back around, but this time there was no fire left in him, just shame. The train slowed, approaching the next station. The doors slid open, a long pause. And then Richard stormed out, shoving past a few confused passengers on the platform. The doors closed behind him. Silence. Then, "Damn, that was crazy," a young man muttered, shaking his head. The businesswoman sat down again, crossing her arms. Some people never learn. James leaned back in his seat, rolling his shoulders. The adrenaline still pulsed through him, but his face remained calm. The teenager with earbuds leaned in. "Yo, that was some ninja-type stuff. You got training or something?" James gave a small smirk. "Something like that." Another pause. Then a voice from the back of the train. "Thank you for your service." James looked up. It was an older man, his hair white with age, a cane resting against his knee. He nodded once, a knowing look in his eyes. James nodded back. And as the train continued its journey, the tension slowly dissolved. But somewhere, out there in the city, Richard Daly was still fuming, still burning with rage. Would he let this moment change him, or would his hate grow? That was a question for another day. Chapter 1. The Internet Never Forgets. James Carter had barely thought about the train incident after it happened. To him, it was just another example of ignorance in the world, something he had seen too many times to count. But to the Internet, it was something else entirely. It started with one video, a 30-second clip, shaky and low quality, taken by a teenage boy in a hoodie. It captured the exact moment Richard Daly swung at James and missed, only for James to calmly dodge and put Richard in his place. The caption read, "This black veteran just sonned a racist dude on the subway. Wait for it." At first, it had just a few hundred views, then 1,000, then 10,000. By the next morning, it had hit 4.2 million, and James Carter had no idea. It was Monday morning when James first noticed something was off. He walked into his favorite coffee shop, a small, cozy spot in Brooklyn where he had been a regular for years. The barista, a young woman named Maya, usually greeted him with a smile and a, "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Today she just stared. Morning," James said, frowning slightly. Maya blinked, then grinned wide. "Wait, no way. That's you, isn't it?" James frowned. "What do you mean?" Maya pulled out her phone and flipped it toward him. The screen showed a viral tweet, the video of him on the subway, now with 2.3 million likes and over 15,000 comments. James stared at it. "The Internet loves you, man," Maya said, laughing. "You're like the coolest veteran ever." James sighed. He had never been the type to seek attention. His military service had been about duty, not clout. The last thing he wanted was to be a trending topic. Then Maya scrolled down to the comments. Some were positive. "Respect to this man. He kept his cool like a pro. This is how you handle racist idiots. Bro didn't even stand up. Certified badass." But others were different. "Why is everyone making this guy a hero? He humiliated that man. Reverse racism is real. If the roles were switched, everyone would be mad. This vet is just another thug who got lucky on camera." James' stomach tightened. He had seen too many stories of viral moments spiraling out of control. And that's when he saw it. A new post, retweeted thousands of times. Breaking. The man from the subway, identified as Richard Daly, claims he was set up and harassed. He is now speaking out. James froze. Richard Daley wasn't done. He was fighting back. Richard Daley sat across from a conservative talk show host, looking like a man on the edge. His eyes were red, his face tight with frustration. "I was just trying to have a normal ride home," he said. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with calculated emotion. "And then this guy, this so-called hero, made me look like some kind of monster." The host nodded sympathetically. "And now people are attacking you online?" Richard nodded furiously. "My job fired me. My family's getting threats. I can't even walk outside without people filming me. All because of one edited video that makes me look like the bad guy." James watched the interview from his apartment, his hands clasped together. This wasn't about a subway argument anymore. Richard Daley had declared war, and James had a choice: ignore it or fight back. 2 days later, James found himself sitting in a sleek office in Manhattan, across from a sharp-dressed woman with a Bluetooth earpiece and a phone that never stopped buzzing. Her name was Angela Reed, a crisis manager for viral cases. She had worked with athletes, actors, politicians, all of whom had been sucked into the black hole of internet controversy. "You have two options," she said, tapping her pen against the desk. "You can let this play out and hope it dies down, or you can take control of the narrative." James sighed. "I don't want a narrative. I just want to live my damn life." Angela smirked. "Yeah? Well, that's not an option anymore." She slid a folder toward him. "The media is already making you their story. You can be the villain or the hero, but you can't be invisible." James stared at the folder. Inside were emails from news networks, interview requests, even brand deals. Some people wanted to turn him into a symbol. Others wanted to tear him down. And then there was one last page, a legal threat from Richard Daley. James let out a slow breath. "This guy really won't let it go, huh?" Angela leaned forward. "Number. And the longer you stay silent, the more control he has." James rubbed his temples. He had fought real wars. But this felt like a different kind of battle. And the enemy wasn't just one man, it was an entire system. 3 days later, James sat across from a news anchor on national television. "Mr. Carter," the anchor began, "Richard Daley has accused you of intimidation, harassment, and ruining his life. What do you say to that?" James exhaled. Then looking directly into the camera, he said, "I say, play the full video." A murmur rippled through the studio. The news station did exactly that. For the first time, the uncut footage played live, showing how Richard had started the argument, how he had gotten in James's face, how he had thrown the first punch. James didn't need to defend himself. The truth did it for him. When the video ended, the anchor turned back to him. "So what happens now?" James thought for a moment, then said, "I go back to living my life." The interview ended. The internet exploded again. But this time, the public turned against Richard Daley. His name became a meme. His GoFundMe was shut down. His excuses fell apart. And just like that, the world moved on. But James Carter never forgot. Because in today's world, it only takes one moment to become famous. And it only takes one moment to lose everything. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. James Carter thought it was over. After the interview, the internet had moved on. Richard Daley? He became just another disgraced viral villain, his name lost in the endless cycle of online outrage. His old employer never rehired him. His family stopped defending him. He had disappeared. But James knew better than to assume a man like that would just let things go. And late one night, as he stepped out of his Brooklyn apartment to take out the trash, he saw a car parked across the street. The same car had been there 3 nights in a row. Engine running, headlights dimmed, and inside, a shadowy figure, barely visible, watching, waiting. James felt it in his gut. This wasn't over, and Richard Daley was coming back. The next morning, James went about his routine as usual. He went for a run, stopped by his favorite diner for coffee, and tried to push the uneasy feeling out of his mind. Then his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. Silence. Then, "You ruined my life." James didn't react. He knew the voice immediately. Richard. You should move on, James said calmly. A harsh laugh came through the receiver. Move on? You think this is over? Click. The call ended. James exhaled, gripping his phone. This was no longer just an internet grudge. This was personal, and James knew exactly what men like Richard did when they felt cornered. That night, James barely slept. His instincts were in overdrive. At 3:17 a.m., a sound jolted him awake. A soft creak, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. James was out of bed in an instant. Years of military training had conditioned him to react before thinking. He moved swiftly, silently, grabbing the baseball bat he kept near the closet. Then, footsteps. Inside. Someone was in his home. James pressed his back against the wall, controlling his breathing. Then he heard it. A familiar voice whispering, "Where are you, tough guy?" James' fingers tightened around the bat. Richard. Enough was enough. He stepped into the hallway, his silhouette now visible. Richard turned, his eyes wild, his hands shaking. He held something small and metallic. A knife. "Put it down," James said. His voice was low, controlled. Richard's chest heaved. His clothes were disheveled, his face gaunt. He looked like a man who had lost everything. Because he had. "You took everything from me?" Richard spat. "Now I take something from you." James took a slow step forward. "You don't want to do this." But Richard was too far gone. With a snarl, he lunged. James had 1 second to react. James sidestepped. Fast. Richard's knife slashed through air, missing by inches. James didn't hesitate. He swung the bat with precision. Crack! The wood connected with Richard's wrist, sending the knife clattering to the floor. Richard let out a cry, staggering backward, clutching his arm. James advanced, his eyes cold, unflinching. "You're done," he said. Richard gasped for breath, his eyes darting to the knife on the ground. His muscles tensed, ready to dive for it. James lifted the bat slightly. "Try it." A long pause. Then, Richard broke. His shoulders slumped, his face crumpled, and for the first time, the rage disappeared. All that was left was defeat, and maybe, just maybe, regret. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the cops, and this time Richard wasn't walking away. The headlines came fast. Man who went viral for subway confrontation, arrested after breaking into veteran's home. Richard Daley faces felony charges, claimed he was ruined by viral video. James Carter speaks out. This was never about race. It was about a man who couldn't let go. James sat on his apartment balcony, sipping his coffee, watching the sunrise. His life had changed forever. He had been a soldier, a viral sensation, and now a survivor of something far more personal. Would Richard ever learn? Would he ever change? James didn't know, but he did know one thing. Some battles weren't fought in deserts or on city streets. Some battles were fought in the hearts of men, and not everyone wins. The end. Do you think Richard deserved what he got? What would you have done? Comment below. Alert.